Hi, guys. Welcome to the Bilz Bites Podcast. On this show, we dive deep with passionpreneurs to uncover what drives them and discuss how they are transforming their life and work with AI. Today's guest, we have Professor Rehan, a distinguished author and a fellow colleague at HULT International Business School. Welcome to the show, Rehan.
Hi there. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You're welcome. Rehan, if you were to write a book about yourself, how would the first chapter look like?
Wow, that's a really tough question, So maybe something like, the journey appeared to be a long one when he looked out to the horizon. So he decided to take a step, then took another step. Soon he was into his stride. But before he knew it, the journey had come to an end and he had arrived upon the horizon. I think that summarizes life, basically. Life goes by like that. You're young, you're like in primary school, you go through secondary school, you go through university, then suddenly you get into your 50s and it's gone like that. So I think sometimes, how we use our time is really important with regards, that. So that's probably how I'd start it.
I love that introduction. And the way those words, you just got my attention and you gripped me, and I just wanted to hear more. So I can understand why you are a distinguished author. But yeah, I'd just like to uncover a bit more on your backstory. Yeah. So I did some research, and I noticed that you had a fantastic career in the corporate world, in the UK with a large telecom company.
Yep.
So I'd like to know more about that, and then how did you end up as an author, professor, and that journey?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the interesting thing is probably I've always been interested in writing, right? So when I was in primary school, I remember as a 9-year-old, I had an American exchange teacher, and she came and she really encouraged me to write. Rehan, you should write. And I remember writing this story about a friend of mine called Andrew. And he basically, the story was his parents had left him, they'd gone on holiday, they'd forgotten him, okay? And he was at home by himself. Now these burglars were trying to break in. And he set all these traps for these burglars. Okay, that sounds like Home Alone, doesn't it? Right?
Yep.
Now, I wrote that in 1980 as a 9-year-old. Now, my teacher, who was an American exchange teacher, actually came from Beverly Hills, California, the home of Hollywood. So I reckon maybe my story somehow got into making into movie Home Alone. Obviously, that's wild speculation. But I was always interested in writing, right? So I was always interested in that. And that's, I guess, how I probably started writing. But then you go to university, you get a corporate career. I was in the corporate sector for about 30 years. But then, I think it was around 2009. At the time, my daughter was about 6. And I was the COO for a company. And she said to me, Abu, or Daddy, she said, what do you want to be when you grow up? Okay, very cute thing for a child to say, right? And because, for her as a child, someone's parent is a doctor, or someone's parent is a teacher, or someone's parent is a police officer. But I was kind of this guy who goes to the office and just does something which kids aren't sure about. Like, what do they do? Like, as a knowledge worker, right? And I think most knowledge workers who are parents probably have difficulty explaining to their children what they do in PowerPoint and Excel and Word, right? And so for her, it was very bizarre. But what it did for me, that stumped me, that question, because she said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it took me back to 1980 and my American teacher telling me you should write, Rehan. And I thought, I always wanted to be a writer. So obviously, when you have kids at school and fees to pay and rent to pay, you can't just say, right, I quit, guys, I'm off, see you later. It doesn't work like that. So then you have to start a parallel track, right? You have to pay the bills, do that, and then start something in parallel. And so then I started this journey around 2010, I think, of initially writing some film scripts and stuff before that, and then getting into more writing into novels. So that's how I kind of, got into writing novels. So it was a bit of a circuitous route. It started with a spark, then it kind of dampened out, and my daughter reignited the spark. So I'm always eternally grateful.
I see. So you potentially wrote the Home Alone script. Amazing.
I'd like to think that. I'd never been paid, and of course, I'm sure I won't ever get paid.
Yeah, but
for
I
that.
mean, you would have to have a really good imagination to come up with such a storyline.
Yeah.
So you wrote when you were younger in school, and you were good at it, I presume. Then when you progressed to university and your corporate life, that's when writing was more business for reports and presentations and things like that.
Yeah.
So when you picked it up again later on in life, how was that transition to start writing in parallel with your full-time job and things like that?
Yeah. So look, I think one of the things about the corporate world, you've been there, you know it, that companies get into groupthink, right? Everyone starts to think the same. They all start to make the same mistakes. The same new business plan gets released this year that got released 4 years ago, but everyone's forgot about it, right? And everyone starts going into kind of like thinking the same and doing the same thing. Now, what I found was that the fact that I was an artist, a writer outside of my day job, that almost gave me a different prism through which to shine a light. Because everyone was doing the corporate thing. Okay, this is what we do, and thinking the same and making the same mistakes. But any artist will tell you they see the world very differently. Artists see the world through a very fresh and very organic and very elemental kind of lens, right? And what that does in a corporate environment, you suddenly see things very differently. You spot things that other people don't. And that's real diversity. If you want diversity at the executive level, it's how people think. So suddenly, you may see an organization more as like a forest and think, oh, that's a really good metaphor for building a company. It's like a forest. And what does a forest do? It's it's an ecological environment. There are plants and animals that, supply each other. That could be a metaphor for how am I going to build a company? Maybe you see a company like a city built with great serendipity, or you could do this, you could do that. So essentially what artists do, they suddenly have a different frame through which to see the world. And I always found that what I could do then was I could bring that lens of literature, of arts into my corporate environment. And I remember once I was going for a particular executive job, and one of the people on the board who was interviewing me said, what difference are you going to bring? And I said, well, how many people that you're interviewing write novels? And they said, okay, you got the job. Because suddenly, it's like very different, right? It's very fresh. Imagination, ideas, how you see things, how you do things. So I think that really helps. And I think also, if you look at it, the most interesting ideas, whether it's entrepreneurial ideas, or whatever it might be, the most interesting ideas often happen at the edge of two systems. When two systems meet, so if you look at where the sea comes into the land, that marshland that's created between the sea and the land, that has unique organisms on it. Organisms that don't thrive anywhere else. Because you have two systems meeting. And so when you're an artist, you bring one system and the corporate brings a different system. And then you suddenly create something very unique. So my kind of advice to myself and to others, even if you're working away, you're doing whatever you're doing, right? Do something else outside that will just give you that little edge. It could be that you just do painting. It could be that you write. Whatever it might be. But just do that because it'll bring something to your work environment.
Thank you for that. When you talked about two systems coming together, something that comes to my mind is, so I understand we have a left brain and a right brain. The left brain is more for our analytical function, and the right brain is more for our creative function.
Yeah.
And if I tell you, Rehan, can you run or hop on your left leg? And if you do 100 meters, you may do it in, say, 3 minutes.
Yeah.
But if I tell you run on both legs, your left and your right, you won't do it in half the time. You'll do it in maybe 1/3 or even 1/4 of the time because of the synergy between the two legs. And similarly, in an organization, you have all the analytical power, and with the creative brain coming in, brings that synergy.
Exactly.
But during your career, you only picked up writing later on.
Yeah.
In between, were you still engaging in reading a lot of literature? Was that something that you kept up with?
Yeah. So although I started writing novels really around 2010 onwards, before that I was doing some film scripts, and before that I was doing some kind of journalism as well. So I was always writing, and I've always been reading as well. So I think, if anyone wants to be a writer, they have to be a reader first. Yeah. So if anyone has come to you and said, "Oh, I wrote this amazing book and it's going to sell millions," right? The first question to ask them to see if they're a phony or not is, okay, how many books do you read? Oh, I don't need to read. I don't have time to read, but I've written a great book. Okay, good luck. Okay, because writers have a certain humility that actually there are magnificent writers out there, and I need to learn from them. Yeah. So that's the first kind of red flag if you spot a phony writer that they don't read. And so I think reading is a habit which unfortunately has been in decline, and our brains have now almost switched to a skipping brain, whereby people just skip between headlines and then they click on the next headline and they click on the next line. So what's happening is that our thinking, and there's again a lot of research in this, but our thinking is becoming very superficial, right? Whereas when you read a book, it's long form thinking, right? It's long because you're going very deep. And the payoff comes at the end because you have to get through the book. Whereas if you just hit that TikTok thing or the Instagram thing, the immediate payoff, dopamine, immediate payoff, dopamine. And so really, you might be feeling good because of the dopamine, but at the same time, you're burning through all that oxygenated glucose in your brain and you feel tired as well, right? You read a novel, what you're doing, you're operating at a more rhythmic pace that humans have always operated at. You're going very deep. You can think, right? And the way I see it, books are like a simulation for the brain. Now imagine we do computer simulations, right? You want to look at what's the weather like. Okay, well, you know that if an area of high pressure meets an area of low pressure, it's likely to rain. However, what if that happens over a mountain range? What if it's a northerly wind? Okay. What if there's, a forest nearby? What's going to happen then? So computer systems will then simulate a particular model. So when you read a book, your mind, essentially, you are exercising your mind because you're running a simulation. You have these different characters in these different settings, undergoing these different, plot structures with these conflicts, with these human emotions, right? And suddenly your brain is simulating all this. So you're developing your cognitive, infrastructure in your mind by reading through that. Right? Very different from click, 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 click on TikTok. Nothing's happened to your brain. Literally, you've just kind of damaged it. So in many ways, I think, I kind of remind myself and obviously remind others that, reading, if you want to really get smart and you want to be ready for the future, reading is critical. If you look at the World Economic Forum's top 10 skills for the future, I think they talk about empathy, creativity, they talk about resilience, they talk about creative thinking, curiosity, etc. So of the top 10, if you look, all of the skills are soft skills. There are two skills in the top 10. One is technology literacy, and the other one is AI and AI and big data. But the other 8 are soft skills that they're saying these are the top 10 skills for the future of work. So how can you develop those soft skills? Well, there's so much academic literature out there that tells us that when you read, for example, let's just take one of the skills, empathy. So when you read a book, you suddenly are in someone else's point of view. You see the world from someone else's perspective, right? So your empathy starts to improve. There was one study done, I think, there are many, many studies, but one study I recall that was done at the University of Toronto, I think it was. And they looked at, so they got some people in to come in and divided into 3 groups. They were then given some names and asked if they could recognize certain names. Now, some of the names were just random names. Some of the names were of non-fiction authors, and some of the names were of fiction authors, so people who wrote stories. And of course, then they surmised that the people who recognized the names of the writers were people who read more books. Okay, great. Then so now they have 3 groups, right? Ones who don't recognize any writers' names. Ones who recognize, oh yeah, these are non-fiction, I've heard of those guys. And these are fiction readers. They then gave them 2 tests. One test is called the eyes in the mind test. And what this is, you show people pictures of people's eyes, just their eyes. And you asked the subject, what's that person thinking? So this is a typical test for autism, for instance. They do that. And then they give them a second test, and they showed them a video of people in social situations. So, for example, there were two men playing squash, and it was obviously a silent video. And they're just, after the game, they're just chatting and so on. And then the subjects had to guess, what are they saying? Could they read the body language, the cues without the sound? And what they found was that those subjects who were the people who were readers, their ability to do the minds and the eye test, like what the eyes are telling you, and their ability to look at the videos in silence and figure out what people were saying was just incredibly higher than the people who just read nonfiction. Yeah. Because nonfiction is good for giving you information, right? Perfect. Yeah. Doesn't necessarily give you wisdom, right? And we live in a world which we're awash with information, but there's very little wisdom around. And what it also doesn't teach you, it doesn't teach you the human skills, which is what this World Economic Forum report was talking about, right? So if you want to be ready for the future of work, you have to be more human. Well, guess what, guys? Literature is a really easy way to do that.
I see. Very interesting. So personally, I read a lot of nonfiction. I rarely read fiction. But nonfiction, when you're talking about or you're reading about the stories of entrepreneurs or biographies, those are also stories, and the entrepreneurs are the characters in the story.
Correct.
Would that not give the same benefit as reading a fiction book?
Yeah, so when you read biographies are great to read because you learn about people's stories, as you say, their struggles and so on. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't provide that simulation for your brain. Because when you read a narrative fiction, right, the author has architected a novel with complexity, right? And so what you'll find is that people who write biographies will often copy the narrative structure of a novel. So the biography starts with like a compelling event. This thing happened, and it set this person off on this journey. And so most biographies are followed like the narrative arc of a hero's journey, typically, right? But that's based on a fictional archetype, right? The fictional archetype. And generally in fiction, there are 7 kind of plots, roughly. So for example, maybe the plot is the quest. A group of people have to go on this journey. They have to find something. They have to recover it. They have to bring it back. Like the Lord of the Rings, for example, or in the Chinese tradition, the journey to the West, for instance. So you've got these kind of stories. Then you've got the kind of overcoming the monster one, where there's this force of antagonism, which is threatening to destroy you, and you have to somehow overcome that. Now that could be a story like Beowulf, like a very classic, story from Europe, a very old story. It could be something like The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It could be any Marvel film, right? Typically, but it could also be the fact that the story of an entrepreneur who is fighting like a bigger competitor, who is like this force of antagonism, and how do they overcome that? Right? So all these, and there are 7 archetype structures in terms of plots. But when you read a novel, especially quality literature, the writer has then architected it with all of these little elements, which I think you get, which is much more than what you just get from a biography.
Thanks for that. So we understand that reading literature builds these soft skills such as empathy. Can you give me some examples how this can be applied in leadership today?
Yeah. Well, look. So first of all, there are so many lessons, leadership lessons. Let's give some real practical examples. So there's a book by Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian novelist. Okay? He wrote War and Peace, and he wrote many books. One of his books that he wrote was called How Much Land Does a Man Need? And it's about a peasant called Pahom. And Pahom basically desires some land for him and his family. He gets some land. Then he actually is not content with that, and he wants a bit more. And he gets a bit more. And he keeps on growing. Eventually, he meets these people who live on the steppes, and they have I think they're Tartars, but they live on the steppes and they have access to a lot of land. And they say to him, well, you can have as much land as you can walk in a day and come back. So why don't you just walk out there, go as far as you can go, and then just turn back? And that'll be all your land. So then the next day, he doesn't sleep all night because he's like really stressed. I need to get as far as I can. Da, da, da. He sets off, doesn't eat in the morning. He gets cracking at dawn, goes off, and then, thinks, I've got enough land now, I think. But then he sees a bit more land ahead of him and he thinks, that would be good to get that one as well. And he keeps on going. He gets there and he thinks, those trees look really good. Let me get that as well. He goes there. It starts to get hotter. And he keeps telling himself, I've probably gone too far. I need to take a step back now and I need to go back. And he doesn't. He keeps on going. Then he realizes he's gone so far to get back, he's going to have to run and rush. So he starts to rush, run, get back. Eventually, he gets just back to where these people are waiting for him and he drops dead. So the only land he needed was 6 feet to bury him. Now that is a leadership lesson. How many leaders push themselves too far? They destroy their health. They destroy their families. For what? Really, right? So you see immediately there, you think, oh yeah, that's a great leadership lesson. I could learn something from that, right? Take something like the Iliad by Homer, like great Greek story, 8th century BC. So what's the story about? Well, the story is about friendship. It's about love, but it's also about fate and free will. Okay, that's interesting. So free will means, do I have a choice? I don't have a choice. So we live today in a world where we are immersed in technology and people keep thinking, my smartphone seems to know everything about me. So essentially we're living in a world of AI algorithms that some would argue are manipulating us. So the question is, how much free will do you have? Right? So again, you've got a work of literature which is discussing that, right? And here's an example. And I could go on with many other examples as well, going back to literature. But the point is that good literature examines the human condition. It looks at things why humans have always been concerned about, whether it's peace, love, war, marriage, friendship, whatever it might be. And as leaders, right, that's it also covers those things. Yeah, that's why it's relevant for today, because many of the leadership lessons we find in literature, we can apply to our working environment. And literature is not going to suddenly give you the answer. It's not like a manual. Oh, I read this and here's the answer. No. But what it does, it's a workout for your brain. So it builds capacity. So if you're thinking about why should I read literature, think about I'm building capacity to deal with human situations, because the novels contain ideas about characters who are going through struggles, right? And often you as an individual, as a leader, may be going through a struggle at some level. Maybe your employees, and your success is dependent on how good your employees are. It's not down to you, because the more senior you become, the more dependent you become on the infrastructure below you. So you have to deal with their problems. They're not robots. So if you don't understand human emotion and the human condition, how are you going to optimize people psychologically to deal, with the challenges you said?
As you were talking, something came to my mind. Another benefit of reading literature and going through these different stories. As you said, there were 7 storylines, because it's quite evident today that storytelling is very important in an organization. The story behind your brand, the stories you tell your employees to influence them, motivate them. And I believe by reading literature, you would naturally become a better storyteller. Is that true?
I think so. Yeah. No, I agree.
As when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned that so writing. Just like to switch to writing. I found that when I write, so my profession as a valuation expert, we have to draft valuation reports, and I find that when I'm actually writing the report, we may have done all the analysis. When you move to the report drafting stage, I find that the writing process actually uncovers new thoughts, new ideas, and then we go back and we do more analysis. And then I've also learned that a lot of the top entrepreneurs, they also write every day. Like Jeff Bezos used to write that daily memo to his employees and to the investors. Warren Buffett also writes. How has writing benefited you in both personal life, corporate?
Yeah. I mean, writing essentially is the language of the brain, right? Because what you're doing, you're articulating your thoughts, you're reflecting. And too often leaders and executives are like in a rush to get things moving. And then they keep making the same mistake again and again. So some of the names you mentioned there, and to that you could add obviously like, Bill Gates was known for his reading. Productivity experts like Tim Ferriss, for example, big reader.
I like him.
Yeah. People like on the political scene, Obama, for example, big reader. Yeah. And those are the people from the West. And I'd say there are more people in the East probably who are less well known, who are very, avid readers. And so I think that what reading does and what you described there is kind of operating at a level in such a way that is comfortable for human thought to develop as you're writing away. Yeah. And, research shows that students who sit in class and type up the notes directly compared to students who sit in class and basically either write the notes or retype them in a way where they're putting their own thoughts on that, either putting it into their own words, their recall is higher. So if you could just type what the professor is saying, or if you're actually writing it and then putting it into your own words later, in the second situation, your recall is better because you're imprinting it into your mind. So what you're describing, uncovering things, a certain level of imprinting is happening as you're doing that in a slower form. And you're going deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, we're in Dubai for this podcast, and this region here has a tradition of like pearl diving. Now, the pearl divers in the GCC, in the past, they would hold their breath, put a nose clip on, and then they would dive deep into the ocean. And they knew that only when you went deep did you find the pearls. Your brain is like that. Your mind is full of jewels. But are you diving deep to find them? Or are you just in the shallows? Yeah. So what you're describing, writing, you're diving deep. The late Harvard professor Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote a book called Flow. He talks about flow states, right? And he describes how when he would observe artists and painters doing their work, he said that they just seemed to be in this kind of flow state. And then they would just finish their stuff and go away. And how these artists described it, they said it was that time and space just disappeared. Yeah, time and space disappeared. And so what I find is what I'm writing, right? Time and space disappears completely. And from a neurochemical perspective, what we know also, the research around flow, that when you go into flow state, where you're so immersed in something that, you lose track of time. In your brain, all the pleasure chemicals are going off. Norepinephrine, oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine. So basically all the neurochemicals to make you feel good are actually being fired off in the brain. Yeah. So if you want to feel good, find something that you can get into flow. And writing and reading is one of the easiest things.
Do you think anyone can be a writer? You did mention that you need to be a reader to be a writer.
Yes.
So let me rephrase the question. Do you think any reader can be a writer?
Yes, but it depends what are you writing for. Now, traditionally people would write a diary, and it was a personal diary, and they wrote it for the purposes of posterity, i.e., maybe they'd pass it on to their kids, right? Yeah. Or they'd reflect back on it decades later. But it wasn't to publish, right? Unfortunately, today, a lot of people seem to have this almost like illness that they want to publicize everything they're doing, and they want to publish everything they're doing. So if you're writing for that intention, then you probably can't be a writer because your intention is wrong, right? But if you're writing as a craftsperson, I want to get really good at this craft. Yeah. And the the outcome might be that you produce a book. Okay. And, we're focusing on the outcome, right? I want to climb this mountain. Okay. But what habits have you put in place? Are you training? Do you know how to survive in a tough environment, right? If you haven't put the right habits in place, how are you going to do that? So often people who set themselves, I want to write a book. Okay, but they haven't got the right habits. They're not writing 1,000 words a day. They're not looking at the world like a writer does. Yeah. So I think it's very much down to why. If it's like, yes, you actually want to produce a book, then you need the right habits. You need to think like a craftsperson. Yeah. But yeah, if you just want to write as a diary, as a reflection, then of course anyone can write. Yeah. Anyone can write.
You said look at the world as a writer. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think writers are observers of people, of places, of things. So for example, maybe I'm sitting in a garage and I'm waiting for my car to, get fixed. And maybe I'm waiting at a train station, right? Or a bus stop. What do people do today? They take out a smartphone and like a mindless robot, tick, 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 tick. They're playing some kind of game, right? Or something, whatever. Most writers I know wouldn't do that. Unless, they had to check something like a schedule or something. They'd be looking at the world. They'd be looking at the trees. Oh, what kind of tree is that? Is it a cedar? Is it, is it a birch tree? What type of tree is it? They'd be looking at the flowers. Oh, that's interesting. Look at the colors there. They'd be looking at the insects flying around. They'd be assessing the wind. Which way is the wind direction coming from? They'd be looking at people. Oh, interesting how that guy walks. Oh, it's very interesting how that lady's dressed. Okay. They'd be observing, the train coming in. As the train comes in, what sound does it make? Oh, that's an interesting sound. Yeah. So suddenly what a writer does, a writer looks at the world of the sensorium, of things around you, because the world is full of just, majesty, incredible things, right? You just look at the insects flying around. You look at the bees going from one flower to another flower. Yeah. You look at the birds and you have, whatever the different type, it could be a hoopy bird. It could be any type of bird. You just observe it, right? There's so much to see. And that's how you draw on what then you're going to write. Because if you're not authorial in your writing, why should someone read it? Rather than saying, oh, the character walked past this tree. Yeah, anyone can write that. Or you could say, yeah, the character scooted past this kind of palm tree or this gaff tree or whatever it might be, right? Because you're being more authorial. So that's what I mean. The writers view people, places, and things, and they're always making notes and observing. Not that, I want to use this in my next book. No, what you're doing, you're actually building a repository for yourself because you as a writer are investing in your future self. Who do I want to become? Right? And we don't know the answer for that, of course, but you're saying that I view an investment in myself. Seriously, people who invest in financial instruments and products, what are they doing? They're investing for some payoff in the future. So if you're investing in yourself through learning skills, through understanding the world about you, yeah, and you're spending time that you are investing in your future self because you're going to get a payout at some point. However that might be, it doesn't have to be financially, right? So that's what I mean by writers kind of are observers.
It's interesting because what I hear is that writers are very present in the moment. Personally, I'm unconscious most of the time. Only when I consciously realize that, hey, I need to become more present, notice the colors around me, notice the environment around me, then it feels much better.
Yeah.
And I notice sometimes when I read something and I see the author is clearly describing the imagery in the scene and he paints the picture of the scene. And I'm actually quite impressed because I feel I could never write like that. And I think it's because I don't read as much nonfiction. And I think and I haven't since I was a child. I was not encouraged to read nonfiction. And I think that has impacted me terms of my imagination and then articulating what's in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this thing about being present, I think there's some researchers, I think Harvard, Killingworth and Gilbert, I think, and their research showed that 47% of the time, people are not present. Their mind is wandering. So they should be present, but they're thinking about the past or they're worried about the future. Either, this happened, that happened. Oh God, this happen, that might happen. So they're not in the present, right? Now, the best teachers I've studied with were present. They gave you their full attention. And when you're with someone who is fully present, you feel that crackling of energy. Something's happening, an exchange is happening. But when you're sitting with someone who is not present, right, you also feel that. Yeah? And unfortunately, these days, you walk into a cafe or something, and there's two people might be sitting together, but they're both on their phone, completely thinking about something else, right? Either depressing themselves about what happened or being anxious about what's coming up, right? So again, from a leadership perspective and from a management perspective, being present, right? If people were more present in meetings, okay, when I was managing teams, I would ensure that any meetings I'd hold, no one could use a laptop. Unless you're presenting, your laptops will remain shut because you need to be making eye contact. Yeah, because we can get the meeting done within 20 minutes. We don't need an hour. Yeah. Whereas everyone's got the laptop open and you see it in meetings, right? So yeah, someone's like, people are talking away and then someone gets asked a question and they obviously haven't been concentrating. And then they'll say, oh yeah, I think we should give that some more consideration, right? And that's a typical answer, right? Yeah, because they haven't actually even heard what the discussion was, right? So the number of times, managers waste time, right? Because they are not present or their people are not present. That adds to the bottom line. Yeah, because you could have got that thing done and you could be on to the next thing. You could be serving that customer. You could be working out the strategy. You could be looking at how can I, improve my cash, pull through in the organization. You could be thinking about what leaders should be thinking about. But what are generally people doing? Complaining, I don't have enough time. You have a lot of time.
Yep.
It's what you do with it.
On that point, with the shift to remote work, people taking Zoom calls, and I'm also guilty of this when I used to be on calls. Whether my camera is on or not on, I would secretly have my phone or have another browser open and actively participating in the call, but at the same time, not fully attentive because my mind is also elsewhere. And then I'd realize that when I get off the call, there were things that I would have missed. And then I would have to go back and try to catch up. And again, I think that adds to your point that calls could be done much quicker.
Yeah, for sure.
Coming back to writing. So for you, when you write, you get into a state of flow. And I believe it's just you and probably no internet browser. It's just you and the pen and paper, you and the keyboard. But how did you manage to fit this into your busy schedule, given that you had a 6-year-old daughter, you were a C-suite manager in a corporate company in London, which is a busy, intense corporate culture?
So I think, look, one of the things, so I family, 2 kids, wife, and we've lived in Dubai now for about 20 odd years. Now, in order to structure your time as a creative or an artist around a corporate job, one of the key things is ritual, right? I think I wish I said it, but I didn't say it. Someone said it. They said that great creative minds think like artists, but work like accountants. And you like that. As a CA, I'm sure you appreciate that. And so what they're getting at there is that, you think like an artist, but you work like an accountant, i.e. you're in the detail. Yeah, it's a craft, right? And you have to go and do the small stuff as well. And that's the only way you improve. So the first thing is you have to have some kind of ritual. Okay, I will write between this time and this time. And the second thing, what you need to do is you need to remove friction from your environment. The more friction you removed, like any decisions you have to make, where am I going to write? No, I'm going to write here. Okay, this is my desk, this is my chair, I'm writing here. Okay, that's a piece of friction you removed, all right? Or should I go to the cafe? Or should I go here? No, decide in advance. Okay. What will be your accompanying drink? You know, you can have some water, you can have some coffee, you can have some tea. Decide in advance. You've removed friction, right? What am I going to write on? Am I doing it by hand? Am I doing it using a computer? Decide in advance. Remove the friction. So basically, when you start getting into all these habits, right, you minimize the friction. And what that does, that then gives you more cognitive capacity to apply yourself to the writing. Yeah. So I had to, and I'm sure others do the same thing. I had to basically train myself to, in the hour and a half every morning that I would write. And that was my biological prime time, right? I knew that that's when I was at my peak. Like so when I was working in a corporate, I would generally write from 7 a.m. to 8:30, for example, or 6:30 to 8, for example. And now I start a little bit later because I'm doing my own thing, so it's a bit different. But that time was my golden time to write. So the entire environment, and obviously with the family as well, everyone knows, don't disturb during this time. Yeah, I'm available at other times, but that time is the golden time. Do not disturb. So part of it is putting that ritual in place. And the more you do that and the more friction you remove, the faster it'll be to get into flow. So initially when I used to write novels, it would take me about 45 minutes to get into flow state. Yeah. Now I'm there in about 5 minutes.
Wow.
But that's like, I've been doing this for now 14 years. Right?
So you've trained yourself.
I've trained myself. But that training then also helped me at work. Because then if I was then doing a Excel model or I was reviewing something, you know, I could just use the same skill that I'd learned as a writer, right? You shut everything out, go deep, get what I need to get done, produce a great set of deliverables. I remember one of my managers at the time, he said to me, Rehan, your Excel spreadsheets, they're like a work of art. He said, they're beautiful. How do you do it? And it's literally because to me, it was about creating excellence. Whatever I was doing, how can I create excellence so that my work can speak for me when I'm not in the room? And that's when you know that you'll never have a problem in getting a job. It's like when your work speaks for you and you're not there. Hey, that guy Bilal, seen his work? Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, we should have him on our team, right? So that's where you need to get to. I think there's an American comedian called Steve Martin. I don't know if he still does comedy, but he's quite a famous guy. And it took him about 30 years to break through, right? And I think he broke through on Saturday Night Live. He played all these clubs in these dingy locations. But he said that get so good, become so good that they can't ignore you, right? Because you become so good at what you do, you don't need to promote yourself. Everyone's going to come running at your door, yeah? And part of that is that ritual, right? How am I doing this? It's like an athlete, they're about to run 100 meters, right? They're not having a Big Mac just before that. They're tuning their body. They're doing all for 10 seconds. 10 seconds. But they spend years training for 10 seconds, right? So why do we think then that when we go into work in a corporate, that I shouldn't train myself? Well, I just turn up. I'm ready. No, you're not ready. What training have you done for your mind to make sure that when you arrive, everyone wants you on their team? If you haven't trained yourself, well, you'll be unemployed and unemployable, right?
Similar to what Malcolm Gladwell has said in Outliers, you got to put in the 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
Which is that hour every morning. So I started writing last year when I dived into entrepreneurship. But for me, it was for the wrong reasons. As you said earlier, it's more to publicize, build a personal brand, position myself as a thought leader or key person of influence in my industry. The mistake I've been making with writing, and I need to fix this, and I don't know how, and maybe you can advise me, is that I write with my browser open or with my ChatGPT open, and I use that to augment what I'm writing. I don't ask it to write for me because I just hate how ChatGPT writes, but the thinking and the research, so I'll be getting the ideas and then putting it in my own words. But you are saying it should just be you and the pen and paper and block out everything else.
Yeah, you or the word processor or whatever you're using.
Yes.
Yeah. So are you writing? Like more like a book or blogs, or what do you write?
It's more blogs.
Yeah. So look, any writing process. So like with these novels, 30% of the effort is design, and 70% is writing. Yeah. So when you put a novel together, it's like basically when you put a building together, the architect will create the blueprint. Yeah. The loads, the balances, the forces, the materials, etc. Right? They design the blueprint. Then the general main contractor builds the building. So writing is the same thing. So what you're describing is that essentially you need to be actively online for the design process. You're designing, you're researching. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, let me take a blank piece of paper. I've suddenly discovered all these things in my research. Oh, I've got these 10 points. They really look interesting. Okay, let me color code this. Okay, now how could I actually write a piece whereby there's a certain flow with these 10 points? Oh, I think this one goes first. I could write 200 words on that. Oh, this point goes next. I could write 300 words on that. So there, your browser is open. You're doing research. You're building your design. You're blueprinting it. Now that you've done that, shut everything. Yeah, because you've got your blueprint. Now write. Yeah, so architect it, then write it. Whereas if you're trying to write and then you keep on, then suddenly, that looks interesting. No, that looks interesting. This is the same problem with novelists who, like I write historic fiction and I also write some fantasy. But I know some novelists who are historic fiction novelists and they love research, but they never get out of the research process because they suddenly find something else. Oh, that's really interesting. I should put that in. And then they're lost for years. So you need to know when's enough is enough. It'll never be perfect. Yeah. And don't try and make it perfect. Just make it as good as it can be.
Because exactly what you're saying, there are a few pieces that I should have published, but I got stuck in research,
right,
and I never published.
Yeah.
Got it. So there's two books on the table here. One is Tomb of Empires, and another one is more self-help. So how do you decide or determine what you're writing on a particular day or what project? Because it's very different.
Yeah. So I've written 7 novels and I've written 1 business book, which is on distraction. Now, with the novels, as I say, the design process will essentially, once I've designed that, I put a structure in place. Okay. I'll still change the structure a little bit as I go along, but then I know what I'm writing on a particular day. So I know the next day, okay, I'm writing chapter 7 of my novel, and I'm writing this particular scene. I've already planned it, right? Once it's done, then I'll plan the night before what I'm going to write the next day. So I never turn up at my desk and say, what am I going to write today? No. Yeah. You have a project plan, right? And you work to the plan, right? You know, in a corporate environment, if you were trying to, deliver a big project, you'd have a project plan, right? You'd have the resources, you'd have the cost. It's not that a project manager turns up and says, what are we doing today? No, there's a plan. You know what you're doing, right? So the same thing with writing. And why do I do it this way is because I've always had a corporate job or a job which has to pay the bills, right? So if you're a full-time writer, of which there are very, very few people, maybe they don't need to plan so much, right? They can just, let's just see. But for people like myself who have to do something most of the time and then a little bit of writing, that hour and a half, I can't waste it. Yeah. So I need to know exactly what I'm writing. And that then goes back to the planning. And essentially, if you look at any kind of book or novel, normally it's like over 3 acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Okay, that could be like, say, 40 chapters or 50 chapters. Okay, so what's roughly is going to happen in each chapter? I've broken it down. And then within that chapter, what's the flow within that chapter? I've already broken that down. So I've now got all of that detail. And then I start to write.
Your first book took you 4 years to write.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
That's a long time.
What motivated you to push through and continue? And why did it take so long?
Well, part of it was I didn't know what I was doing. And I was going around in circles. And now normally I get the books done in about 12 months. And, you'd think that because you should hopefully get better as you go along, right? So, and what really kept me going was, I'll be honest, I mean, when I started writing, when I got the first book done, which is a fantasy book, it came out in 2014. My intention was not right. My intention was what? Oh, this big book is going to be made into a movie. It's going to be red carpet. I could just imagine myself there, right? And then I'd done a couple of books and I realized my intention was wrong. Yeah, it completely wrong. And I re-evaluated my intention. And I said, no, actually, the intention needs to be, how can I how can I bring in virtue into my life? How can I become, because when you look at the question of, when people say virtue, what is virtue? Virtue basically means, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of person do I want to be? Whereas morals are, what should I do in this situation? Those are the moral dilemmas. Managers have a lot of moral dilemmas. What should I do in this situation? Should I show this clemency to this employee, or should I be tough? That's a moral dilemma, right? That's morality. But virtue is, what kind of person do I want to be? Do I want to be someone who is clement and generous and magnanimous, right? That's your character. That's linked to your character. So I started asking questions about, as a writer, what kind of virtue am I trying to imbue in myself? And so writing then became a craft to become, imbue that virtue into it. And so that was what kept me motivated, kept me going.
Fantastic. So you have a course, How to Design a Virtue-Based Novel. And I read the reviews, fantastic reviews, so many positive reviews. I would like to know more about this course. Who is the target audience?
Yeah. So it's anyone who really wants to write a book where there's an element of virtue. So if you look at a novel, a good novel, it has 4 layers. The first layer is the literal layer. So this is the plot. This happened, it led to this. This happened, it led to this. And every story has to have a plot. It has to have a literal layer. So that's fine. But the great novels then have a second layer, which is the allegorical level. So the allegorical is like, what's the writer really saying? So for example, to choose an example that probably most would recognize, Animal Farm by George Orwell. It's about some animals who overthrow a farmer, but it's really about the Russian Revolution and how the Bolsheviks, lost power and then Stalin came in. That's what it's about. So that's the allegorical level. So a good novel will have a literal level, it'll have an allegorical level. Then a great novel will have a moral level. Okay, so take a book like Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. So it's really about the dangers of excessive sensitivity. If you're too sensitive to situations, right, you become very rash. So that book deals with moral questions. And for managers and for leaders, often at work, they're faced with moral dilemmas. It very rarely will be something be black and white. This is right, this is wrong. Most managers have to deal with right versus right situations.
Gray.
Yeah, it's a gray area. How do I deal with that, right? Well, that's good literature will help you run that simulation in your mind. So good novels have that moral level. And then good novels have the 4th level, which is the spiritual level, which is the question about the self and existence and where am I going and my purpose and who am I? Yeah. So what I try and teach in the course, I teach the mechanics of how to write a novel, how to design the setting, how to design the characters, how to design the plot, right? So the mechanics of that. But I also then try and encourage people, that's why it's called virtue-based storytelling, to consider the 4 elements, the 4 layers, the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the spiritual, because those are the stories that will really resonate with humans. So that's what the course is about.
And how do you find, because this course is, as you said, targeted for people who want to write a novel. How do you find that customer target or audience?
Yeah, I think most people, and like I was as well, hadn't really thought about it. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to help people get up to speed, get to it quicker than I got to it. Because it took me a while to figure it out myself. Like, why am I writing? Yeah. to talk about intentionality. Like, what's your intention? Yeah, if you're writing to become famous, it's probably the wrong intention, right? Yeah, write like you would play an instrument. Yeah, practice, just get better and better and better. And whether 5 people read your book or 5 million people read your book, don't worry about the outcome. Just do the best you can. Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to engineer in people's minds, because otherwise, because you take the pressure off yourself. Then
You can't control the outcome, but you can control the effort and work you put in.
Exactly, you got it.
All right, switching gears to AI. So I understand you consult for multinational companies on the future of work and AI. So I'd love to hear, what have you been talking about to these companies?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear what you're doing as well, because I know you're doing some stuff in this area as well. So let me start, then maybe you can then carry on from there. So as a professor, I teach AI future of work at the business school. And then what happens is that sometimes you get approached by companies who want some advice about AI as well. And I'm finding that there are kind of 2 conversations right now within global corporates around AI. One is a conversation with executives. So as an executive, C-suite, what do I need to know about this AI stuff? And a lot of executives won't necessarily admit they don't know very much, which is fine, because why should they know very much, right? But really, how is this going to help me with my business model, with my operating model, with how I generate cash in the business, with how I deliver customer experience in the business? How will it help me with my supply chain? How will it help me with financial structuring, right? So these are the things that executives want to know about. So what I tend to do is I do some kind of programs for executives in terms of what do they need to know to help them with the decisions. I can't help them with the decisions. They know their business better than I do. But can AI help you in some way? And what is a large language model? What is what's back propagation? All these terms that get used in by the techies. What does it mean from a business perspective? What are the ethical challenges, right? How will this affect your future workforce? What kind of people do you need, right? So these are all the conversations with executives. The second conversation I'm finding in corporations is more at the management and departmental level, right? Okay, so I work in supply chain, or I work in human resources. I work in finance, right? How do I use AI? How is it going to affect, why should I use it? And how will it help me at an operating level? So that's a different conversation. So with that, I have an AI canvas, break down things like, okay, so, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to do this? Okay, what decision flow are you trying to achieve? I'm trying to achieve this decision flow. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so what data do you need to achieve that decision flow? Oh, I need this data. Okay, so do you have the data? Oh, yes, no. Okay, so who has the data? Oh, some of it's proprietary. Maybe some of it we can get from an external large language model. Maybe we can get it from a small language model, right? How do we test that data? So suddenly then you start building an operating flow at a management or departmental level to make it practical for a manager to use it. So I'm finding those 2 conversations right now, the executive one and the more departmental level one. But what about your experience?
It's very interesting that you say that, because I was talking to an ex-colleague of mine, and they said that ChatGPT is blocked in their organization and they have their own tool. But it's not very useful and they're not using it. And I thought to myself that since I jumped into entrepreneurship, I've been advisory work on an independent basis. And obviously to make myself more efficient, I need to leverage these tools. And the more I use these tools, the more ideas I get on how to apply them into my workflow. And then I get curious to learn more, to read more, to understand more, because the more you learn, the more you do, it just all comes together very nicely, such that I have been able to automate 70 to 80% of a valuation workflow. So what would take consultants a couple of weeks to put together a valuation report, with my AI tools, there is manual intervention and we are still using an Excel model, but combined with the AI tools, we can get it done in a couple of hours.
Wow.
Yes. And initially, I was just using it to augment my own workflow and just to improve my efficiency. But then now I've gotten to the point where, hey, maybe I can package all of this and sell it or license it. And my advisory practice is called FVA Advisory. So we've now introduced our software arm, which is FVA Intelligence.
Right.
And we're excited to launch 2 new tools over the next 2 months. So the one tool is for startup valuation, and another one is more for traditional business valuation. And there are projects in the pipeline to develop tools for different types of valuation. So I'll just give an example for the typical business valuation. So initially, when you speak to a client, that initial client call, it's more like information gathering phase. So you're going to ask the client, what is the purpose of the valuation? What does the business actually do? What industry? Is it profitable? What information do you have available? And then after that call, you then sit down and you come up with the scope of work, what valuation approach you're going to take, how much you're going to charge them, and put together an engagement letter. Now what we've done is, so we have a landing page, and when a user comes on, clicks start valuation, comes to a questionnaire. So that questionnaire is the same questions that I would have asked them on that initial call.
Okay.
And the information is then passed through into a custom or a refined LLM with the custom prompt, which will then analyze the information, and based on what we have been told, it then drafts a valuation scope,
right,
the method, and an information request list. It then also proceeds to give a fee, an estimated fee. Then there'd be a drop-down box to upload information.
Right.
There's a DocuSign feature to sign an NDA if they want, and then generate an engagement letter. So that whole initial phase is automated.
So can I ask on that? So like, for example, when you would have done that manually, there'd be a component of it which would be quantitative. You need certain numbers. But then there'd be an element of your requirements capture that would be qualitative as well. So how does the online system deal with that aspect?
So in the initial stages, it's mostly qualitative, because once you understand the purpose, you understand what information is available. And typically for business valuation, if they have, the most common approach is a discounted cash flow, which is looking at a 5-year forecast.
Right.
So if the business is profitable and expected to continue generating positive cash flow, and they have a 5-year forecast available, then we're going to recommend the discounted cash flow. Obviously, if they answer that the business is not profitable, and then follow-up questions come through that, okay, is the business expected to turn profitable? Is the business in distress? Is the business, then obviously we cannot apply that discounted cash flow. So it's like a if or situation. Now, once the information comes through on the back end, so right now it's an MVP. And the idea is to have everything fully automated. But right now we want to launch with the information coming through on the back end. My team can pick it up. And then using the AI tools, they can turn around the valuation in a couple of hours, whereas previously it would take a couple of weeks.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, in between, there is still some back and forth with the client, because we would have follow-up questions. We would want to better understand the business plan and send some due diligence queries. But those are all automated as well. So that can be done within an hour. So that's how the tool works right now. It's an MVP, hoping to launch by next month, get some traction. I think it's always important to validate an idea before you go and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to build it out. So that's where we're at with FVA Intelligence. And that's what gets me excited now every day.
Good. Well, you can see real progress there in a few months, right? And the tools are getting more sophisticated as well and stuff. Good.
So, and what I found is that the more I work with these tools, so just last week, I'm working on a valuation of a Chinese company, and the client gave me a bunch of industry reports. This is public information, but he gave it to me in scanned copies, all in Chinese. It had graphs and charts and tables. And typically, I would just throw it into ChatGPT or Claude, and it would translate it for me, summarize it for me. But this is scanned copies, so these tools were not able to read the documents. And so I went to my brother, and he's like, just use Llama Pass. And that's the first time I heard of Llama Pass. So I logged in, and I passed the information through, and I was just blown away.
Yeah.
It converted all of that information into a readable format,
Right.
JSON, which was then able to feed into the LLM, and then I was able to get the information. And that just opened up my mind to a whole new world of possibilities.
Yeah.
Because so a lot of the time, the valuation that I do is for financial reporting purposes, which ultimately is reviewed by the client's auditor.
Okay.
And the auditor is the one who would then ask me questions to get comfort on my valuation and then sign it off so they can close it off. But now I realize with Llama Pass, these valuation reports, as an auditor, these valuation reports can be fed into Llama Pass. The data can be extracted into a readable format for the LLM, fed into the LLM, which would be a custom prompt, which would ask the right questions to review that report. So that review process can now be done in a couple of hours rather than a couple of weeks.
Right.
Which now just gives me ideas. We can build new products, and these are just GPT wrappers.
Yeah.
Like with an interface and with AI agents doing stuff in the background, but it's not so sophisticated. It's just creative ways of using these.
But this is stuff which is publicly available information. Yeah, which is confidential, proprietary, in-house. You could obviously not do that unless the organization had its own GPT, right?
So the thing is that we are thinking to house everything. We're going to use open source and house everything on our own server.
Yeah.
So with that, you're protected. You're not sending any information to any third party.
Yeah.
And now the open source models are getting really good.
Yeah. I think this has been one of the problems with the heavy kind of costs related to the OpenAI kind of models, right? Because it's got 1.6 or whatever trillion variables, and you have to run that. It's very heavy energy cost, etc. And now with DeepSeek and these other models that are coming out, they're much lighter. They're using sort of what's that term? Is it something of experts? What's it called? I've forgotten myself now. But anyway, the models are much lighter, and you can isolate your data, and you can it reduces the cost basically. So I think that'll open up a lot more opportunities for you guys.
So I'd like to know how are you using AI in your work, in your day-to-day?
Yeah. So surprisingly, in my novels and stuff, I'm not using it at all, right? Because the craft of it's got to be hard. It's got to be a struggle. That's how you get better. If you're using it to write your novel and cheat, if you like, then you're not going to get very good at what you do. Yeah. When it comes to research, sometimes I might use it to do a little bit of research, but I find that if I know the subject well, I find that the research is very shallow in terms of GPT. That's sort of, whether it's OpenAI one or whatever it might be, I don't find as much depth, right? So if you know your subject, I find the AI tools are very shallow. Whereas if you're like, 14, 15-year-old, you don't know very much, you'll be like, oh, wow, it's amazing, right? Or, if you don't give it the right kind of data, it's very, very shallow. So I actually avoid using it. However, where I find that actually it does work really well is when you really break it down for a business. Like, how is a customer service department going to use an AI tool to look at sentiment analysis? Yeah. Or use neural NLP to understand what their customers are saying, right? In that way. So there it's great. Yeah. Or for example, I may be working in aviation maintenance and I'm a technician. I need to repair this aircraft. So wouldn't it be great if I could have a conversation with my data? Okay. So Airbus, Boeing, all of these guys have got huge manuals, right? Which an LLM could potentially read. Then there are safety standards. Then there are all these other standards, right? Now I'm fixing this part on the wing. So wouldn't it be interesting if I could have a voice interface into my data, have a conversation with my data? It could then extract the right information for me and then let it tell me. That's a great use case. Yeah. So those are things where I find the usage, right? I don't find the usage at a personal level as an academic or as a writer. I'd actually rather do the hard work myself, right? But from a business perspective, that's where I'm helping organizations think through those kind of things. Yeah. Because ultimately it's going to help businesses, right? But for entrepreneurs, it's great. I mean, I have several friends who are entrepreneurs. They're very, fleet of foot. They don't have many employees. So they offload a lot of the stuff to these open source models because they're not worried about the proprietary information and so on. But for most corporates, right, they are very concerned about that. Yeah, you cannot share your proprietary data with these models because it's gone.
Personally, I enjoy using it as they call it like a sparring partner,
right?
A thought partner, where you just dump your thoughts, and the dictation feature is so good. It gets it like right 99% of the time. And and so like previously you'd need a co-founder to bounce your thoughts off, or you'd need a coach or a mentor to bounce your thoughts off. Now you can just get feedback on your thoughts. And so with, in cognitive behavioral therapy, there's the cognitive distortions.
Yeah.
And sometimes if I have a thought, I would just have a custom prompt which goes through the different cognitive distortions, like all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, overgeneralization. And so if I put my thought within that framework, it would then help me take that core to thought and assess whether it's a thought that you should be having or not. So I also enjoy it from that perspective.
Right. I mean, one thing that I kind of always remind myself and others is that these technologies, they don't operate in a vacuum. There is a real cost, energy, water. So ChatGPT, for example, is very thirsty. So the previous version of ChatGPT, if you did an inquiry and you went back and forward 20 times, right, an inquiry, that's the equivalent of using this much water. So basically, if you went on the street, took this much water and you poured it onto the street, you wouldn't do that, right? But if people use ChatGPT in a kind of a frivolous way, oh, hello, how are you? And just having a conversation with it, that's how much water you just used. And that's an earlier version of Chat. The newer ones are even more thirsty. Because remember, these things are going back into data centers. You've got the cooling, you've got the energy, right? So from a carbon perspective, huge footprint. Water perspective, massive resource, right? So if you're going to use ChatGPT or any AI tool, right, that's public, so just be mindful about purpose. Because nothing, just because it's software, it does not operate in a vacuum.
Wow, I didn't realize it consumes water.
Yeah.
I knew about the energy usage, not the water.
Cooling effect, yeah, for sure.
Wow. So just last question. Who inspires you, or who are some of the people that you look up to? Do you have any mentors?
That's a difficult question. Mentors and stuff, yeah. Okay. So I've, I guess, from in a corporate perspective, I've been very fortunate to work with some really great managers over the years, and I still keep in touch with them. And they're people who often, if I have a business problem to go to, I would go to them. And they're mentors for me because I worked with them. Yeah. I'm not someone who believes in having, looking up to someone who I don't know. Like some people say, oh yeah, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Elon Musk. You don't know them, right? You don't know anything about them, right? So I would rather my mentors or people I look up to are people who I've had some relationship with, some human relationship with. So from a corporate perspective, it's people I've worked with. In a life perspective, it's people maybe other writers, other people kind of I've met. So I generally tend to have that kind of mentorship group, right? People who I know, I've had some relationship with, right? Rather than just saying, oh yeah, I look up to this person, because I don't really know them. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Because for me personally, what has really transformed my life is podcasts.
Right.
So I don't know if you know Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO podcast.
No, I don't.
We spoke about 4-Hour Work Week.
Okay.
Tim Ferriss, his podcast.
Yeah.
There's another medical doctor from the UK, Rangan Chatterjee.
Right.
And I've learned so much. And don't know what you call it, but like you feel like you know them because you listen to them over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And then you heed the advice from their guests on the different topics. And that has really transformed health, business, and one of the reasons why I ended up in entrepreneurship. But from the tech side in real life, I think when it comes to IT, it's my brother.
Right.
So he is an ex-business and systems analyst at Rack Ceramics and Al-Futtaim. He's also based here in Dubai. And then he's now an AI automation engineer.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, and so he's helping me with the development of a lot of these tools. And whenever I have a problem, I'm stuck with some technology issue, I go to him, and he's always able to find a solution and how to make things. Like sometimes he'll look at me doing something, and he's like, "You don't need to do that. We can do that in an instant. You don't need to spend the time." So he's the one who told me about Llama Pass and so many other ways of doing things.
Good.
But thank you so much for taking the time to come and join me on this, have this conversation with me. It was super insightful. There's a lot of takeaways for me. And thank you.
Thank you very much. So good.